The conflict known as the War of Austrian Succession did not begin with a single battle or sudden decision, but with a question that many powerful states were waiting to answer. At its center was the issue of succession, the transfer of authority over a vast and complex collection of territories that formed one of the most significant political structures in Europe at the time. This question, while legal in form, carried consequences that extended far beyond law, shaping alliances, ambitions, and the balance of power across the continent. The territories involved were not a single unified state in the modern sense, but a network of lands connected through dynastic rule. These lands varied in culture, language, and political structure, yet they were linked by the authority of a ruling house. Maintaining control over such a system required not only legitimacy, but also recognition from other powers, many of whom had their own interests in how that legitimacy would be defined. In an effort to secure a stable transition, arrangements had been made in advance to establish who would inherit these territories. These arrangements were designed to prevent dispute, to create a clear and accepted path of succession that would be recognized across Europe. However, agreements on paper do not always hold when circumstances change, especially when the stakes are high. When a moment of succession arrived, the situation tested the strength of those agreements. Some powers chose to recognize the established arrangement, supporting the continuation of the existing structure. Others saw an opportunity to challenge it, not necessarily because the agreement was unclear, but because the outcome of that agreement did not serve their interests. This divergence created the conditions for conflict. What had been a question of succession became a broader struggle over influence and control. The territories at the center of the dispute were valuable not only for their resources, but for their position within the wider European system. Control over them could shift the balance of power in significant ways. As different states began to take positions, alliances started to form. These alliances were shaped by a combination of principle and practicality. Some states supported the established succession out of commitment to the agreement, while others aligned themselves based on strategic advantage. In many cases, these motivations were closely connected. The formation of these alliances did not immediately lead to war, but created a situation where conflict became increasingly likely. Each state began to prepare, organizing resources, considering strategy, and assessing the actions of others. The network of relationships that connected these powers became more active as communication and negotiation took place alongside preparation. The geography of Europe played an important role in shaping these developments. The territories involved were spread across different regions, each with its own strategic importance. Control of certain areas could provide advantages in movement, defense, and access to resources. These considerations influenced how states planned their actions and where they focused their attention. As preparations continued, the balance between diplomacy and conflict began to shift. Efforts to resolve the dispute through negotiation were present, but they faced the challenge of competing interests that were difficult to reconcile. Each state had to decide how far it was willing to go to achieve its objectives. When conflict finally began, it did not take the form of a single unified war. Instead, it unfolded across multiple regions, with different campaigns reflecting the interests and positions of the states involved. This made the war complex, as actions in one area could influence outcomes in another. The early phase of the war was shaped by movement and positioning. Armies were deployed, territories were contested, and initial engagements took place that tested the strength and readiness of the forces involved. These early actions did not determine the outcome, but they set the tone for what would follow. At the same time, the war was not only fought through direct engagement. Diplomacy continued alongside military action as states sought to adjust alliances, gain support, and influence the broader situation. This combination of conflict and negotiation added to the complexity of the war. As this first stage comes to a close, the foundation has been set for a conflict that will involve many of the major powers of Europe. The question of succession, which began as a legal matter, has expanded into a broader struggle that will shape the balance of power for years to come. As the conflict moved from preparation into open war, the tensions that had been building across Europe began to express themselves through coordinated action. States that had once observed the situation from a distance now committed their forces, turning a dispute over succession into a wide and interconnected struggle. The war did not follow a single path, but unfolded across multiple regions at once, shaped by the ambitions and strategies of the powers involved. The early campaigns revealed the importance of speed and initiative. Some states moved quickly to secure positions that could strengthen their advantage before their opponents were fully prepared. These early actions were not only about immediate gain, but about shaping the conditions under which the rest of the war would be fought. Control of key territories at the beginning could influence supply, movement, and the ability to respond to future threats. Among the most significant developments during this phase was the entry of powerful states whose involvement increased the scale of the conflict. Their participation brought larger armies, greater resources, and more complex strategies. What might have remained a limited dispute expanded into a broader war that required coordination across long distances. The alliances that had formed before the war now began to operate in practice. These alliances were not always perfectly aligned in their goals, but they provided a framework for cooperation. States shared resources, coordinated movements, and attempted to support each other in ways that would improve their collective position. At the same time, differences in priorities sometimes created tension within these alliances, requiring careful management. The geography of the war played a central role in shaping its early development. Campaigns were conducted in regions that offered strategic advantages, whether through access to resources, defensive positions, or connections to other areas. Control of these regions allowed states to project power more effectively and to limit the options available to their opponents. As armies moved and engaged, the importance of organization and planning became clear. The scale of the forces involved required careful coordination, both in terms of movement and supply. Maintaining an army in the field over an extended period demanded a steady flow of resources, as well as the ability to adapt to changing conditions. The early battles of the war varied in outcome, reflecting the balance of strength between the opposing sides. Some engagements resulted in clear advantages, while others produced more limited results. Each battle, however, contributed to the broader picture, influencing morale, positioning, and the decisions that followed. At the same time, the war was not confined to a single front. Different regions experienced different levels of activity, depending on their strategic importance and the presence of opposing forces. This created a situation where the conflict had to be managed across multiple areas, each with its own challenges and opportunities. Diplomacy continued alongside these military efforts. States remained aware that the war could be influenced not only by force, but by the ability to shape alliances and secure support. Negotiations took place even as campaigns continued, reflecting the complex nature of the conflict. As the war progressed, the initial momentum of early actions began to give way to a more measured approach. States adjusted their strategies based on experience, learning from both success and failure. This process of adaptation allowed them to refine their plans and to respond more effectively to the actions of their opponents. The involvement of multiple major powers also meant that the war was influenced by a wide range of interests. Each state pursued its own objectives, which were sometimes aligned and sometimes in tension with those of its allies. Managing these relationships became an important part of maintaining an effective coalition. The populations within the regions affected by the war also played a role in shaping its development. Armies depended on local resources, and the response of communities could influence how easily operations could be sustained. Support, resistance, and the general condition of the land all affected the ability of forces to move and operate. As campaigns continued, certain patterns began to emerge. Some regions became centers of repeated conflict, while others served as bases for operations. These patterns reflected the strategic value of different areas and the evolving understanding of how the war could be conducted. The balance between the opposing sides remained uncertain during this phase. Gains made in one area could be offset by losses in another, creating a dynamic situation where no single outcome determined the direction of the war. This uncertainty encouraged continued effort on all sides, as each sought to improve its position. Over time, the demands of sustained conflict began to shape the decisions of those involved. Resources had to be managed carefully, and the cost of maintaining large armies influenced how campaigns were planned. This added another layer of complexity as states balanced immediate goals with long-term capacity. By the end of this stage, the war had fully expanded into a major European conflict. The early campaigns had established positions, tested alliances, and revealed both strengths and weaknesses. While no decisive resolution had been reached, the direction of the war was beginning to take shape, setting the stage for the more intense and structured struggles that would follow. As the war continued across multiple regions, the early momentum and scattered engagements gradually gave way to a more structured and consequential phase. The actions taken during the opening campaigns had established positions and revealed the strengths and weaknesses of the powers involved. Now, those lessons began to shape a new stage of the conflict, one defined by more deliberate strategy, larger coordinated efforts, and a growing awareness that the outcome would depend on sustained advantage rather than isolated success. The scale of operations increased during this period as states committed greater resources and brought more organized forces into the field. Armies were no longer assembled simply to respond to immediate threats, but were deployed with clear objectives that reflected long-term goals. These objectives were often tied to key regions whose control could influence the direction of the entire war. The importance of leadership became more pronounced as the complexity of the conflict grew. Commanders were required to manage not only their own forces, but also to coordinate with allies whose priorities did not always fully align. This required a balance between cooperation and independence, as each state sought to pursue its own interests while maintaining the effectiveness of the broader alliance. At the same time, the war began to produce more decisive engagements. These were not necessarily final in themselves, but they carried greater weight in shaping the balance of power. Victories in such engagements could strengthen a position across multiple regions, while defeats could weaken an entire strategic approach. The ability to sustain these efforts depended heavily on organization and supply. Maintaining large forces over extended campaigns required careful planning and the efficient use of resources. States that managed this effectively were able to apply consistent pressure, while those that struggled with these demands found it more difficult to maintain their position. The geographic spread of the conflict continued to influence its development. Different regions became focal points at different times, depending on their strategic value and the movements of the opposing forces. This shifting focus required constant adjustment as states redirected their efforts to meet changing conditions. Alliances remained a central feature of the war, but their nature evolved during this phase. Earlier cooperation, often based on immediate need, became more structured as states recognized the importance of coordinated action. At the same time, underlying tensions within these alliances did not disappear, and managing these tensions remained a challenge. As the war progressed, certain powers began to show a greater ability to adapt to its demands. Their forces became more consistent in performance, their strategies more refined, and their use of resources more effective. This gradual improvement did not produce immediate dominance, but contributed to a steady shift in the overall balance. The opposing side, while still capable and active, faced increasing difficulty in maintaining the same level of coordination and effectiveness. This was not due to a single factor, but to a combination of pressures that accumulated over time. Each campaign required effort and resources, and the strain of continuous conflict began to limit the ability to respond to new challenges. At the same time, the broader political context of the war continued to evolve. Decisions made in one region could influence alliances and strategies elsewhere, creating a complex network of cause and effect. This meant that the war could not be understood as a series of separate events, but as a connected process in which each action contributed to the overall outcome. The populations within the affected regions also continued to play a role in shaping the conflict. Their support, resistance, and capacity to provide resources influenced how effectively armies could operate. This added another dimension to the war, linking military action with social and economic conditions. As this phase developed, the idea of a quick resolution became less realistic. The war had reached a level of complexity and scale that required sustained effort over time. States adjusted their expectations, preparing for a longer struggle in which gradual advantage would be more important than immediate victory. Despite this, moments of significant change continued to occur. Certain campaigns or engagements had the effect of shifting momentum in a noticeable way, reinforcing the position of one side while challenging the other. These moments did not end the war, but they influenced how it would proceed. The cumulative effect of these developments was a gradual movement toward a more defined balance of power. While uncertainty remained, it was no longer as evenly distributed as before. Some states began to hold a clearer advantage, based on their ability to maintain consistent performance across different aspects of the conflict. As this stage approached its conclusion, the transformation that had taken place became more visible. The war had moved from a period of expansion and uncertainty into one characterized by structure, sustained effort, and emerging patterns of dominance. The foundation had been laid for the final phase, where these patterns would be tested and brought toward resolution. As the war entered its later stage, the gradual shifts that had been building over years of campaigning began to produce clearer and more decisive outcomes. The earlier uncertainty, where gains and losses moved back and forth across different regions, started to give way to a more defined structure. The balance that had once held the conflict in a state of tension began to weaken, and the direction of the war became increasingly shaped by those who could sustain pressure and act with greater consistency. The forces involved had, by this point, adapted to the demands of prolonged conflict. Armies were more organized, strategies were more refined, and the experience gained through earlier campaigns influenced every decision. This did not make the war simpler, but it made its movements more deliberate. Each campaign was now part of a broader effort to shape the final outcome, rather than a reaction to immediate circumstances. The scale of operations remained large, but their focus became sharper. Instead of spreading efforts across many uncertain objectives, attention was concentrated on areas that held clear strategic value. These regions, whether important for movement, supply, or influence, became the center of repeated efforts. Control over them could shift the balance in lasting ways. As these campaigns unfolded, the difference in consistency between the opposing sides became more apparent. Those who had developed stronger systems of coordination and supply were able to maintain their efforts over longer periods, applying steady pressure that was difficult to resist. This pressure did not always result in immediate breakthroughs, but it gradually reduced the ability of their opponents to respond effectively. On the other side, the strain of continuous conflict began to show more clearly. Maintaining large forces, coordinating across multiple regions, and responding to an increasingly organized opponent required resources and stability that were becoming harder to sustain. These challenges did not end resistance, but they limited its effectiveness and reduced the ability to recover from setbacks. Leadership during this phase played a critical role in determining how these conditions were used. Decisions were made with a greater awareness of their long-term impact. Commanders sought to avoid unnecessary risk while still pursuing opportunities that could bring meaningful advantage. This balance between caution and action shaped the pace and direction of the war. The alliances that had supported the conflict continued to operate, but their nature evolved further. Cooperation remained important, yet it was influenced by the changing balance of power. States adjusted their involvement based on both their own position and the progress of their allies, creating a network of relationships that required constant attention. Diplomatic activity increased alongside military operations. As the outcome of the war became more predictable, discussions about its conclusion began to take shape. These discussions did not immediately end the fighting, but they reflected a growing recognition that the conflict was moving toward resolution. At the same time, the impact of the war on the regions involved became more visible. Years of campaigning had affected resources, infrastructure, and the daily life of the population. These conditions influenced how easily armies could operate and added to the challenges of sustaining prolonged effort. Despite these difficulties, the decisive phase of the war continued to unfold through a series of coordinated campaigns. Each action contributed to a larger pattern, where the advantage held by one side became more difficult to challenge. The accumulation of these efforts created a momentum that shaped the final stage of the conflict. The geographic structure of the war became more defined as well. Boundaries of control were clearer, and movements of forces reflected this clarity. Campaigns were often aimed at strengthening these boundaries or pushing them in ways that would secure a lasting advantage. As the imbalance grew, the possibility of reversing the course of the war became increasingly limited. While resistance continued, it faced conditions that made large-scale recovery difficult. The focus shifted from seeking decisive victory to managing the outcome in a way that would preserve as much position as possible. This shift marked a turning point in how the conflict was approached. The emphasis moved from expansion to consolidation, from gaining new ground to securing what remained. This change did not reduce the intensity of the war, but it altered its purpose. As this phase approached its conclusion, the overall direction of the war had become clear. The long process of conflict, shaped by adaptation, coordination, and sustained effort, had produced a situation where the final outcome was no longer uncertain in the same way. The remaining steps would bring this process to a close, defining the new balance that would follow. As the war moved into its final stage, the long process of conflict that had stretched across years and regions began to settle into a more stable conclusion. The shifting campaigns, the evolving alliances, and the gradual changes in balance had all contributed to a point where the outcome was no longer shaped by sudden events, but by the accumulated weight of everything that had come before. The war did not end with a single decisive moment, but through a transition in which continued fighting became less effective than negotiation. The recognition of this reality led to an increase in diplomatic activity. States that had once focused primarily on military action began to place greater emphasis on discussion and agreement. These efforts were not simple, as the interests of the participants remained complex and often in conflict. Each state sought to secure the best possible outcome, balancing what had been gained during the war with what could be achieved through negotiation. The process of reaching a settlement required careful consideration of multiple factors. Territorial control, political influence, and the original question of succession all had to be addressed in a way that could be accepted by the major powers. This did not mean that every demand would be satisfied, but that a balance would be found that allowed the war to come to an end. As these negotiations progressed, the structure of the emerging agreement became clearer. Certain changes that had taken place during the war were recognized and confirmed, reflecting the realities created by years of conflict. Other elements were adjusted to create a framework that could support a more stable balance of power moving forward. The final agreements brought an end to the active phase of the war, but they did not erase the effects of what had occurred. The territories involved have been shaped by the conflict, and the relationships between states have been altered in lasting ways. The conclusion of the war marked the beginning of a new phase, where these changes would influence future interactions. One of the most important outcomes was the confirmation of succession, which had been the original cause of the conflict. The recognition of this succession, supported by the settlement, established a form of legitimacy that had been contested at the beginning of the war. This resolution did not eliminate all disagreement, but it provided a foundation for stability. At the same time, the war had demonstrated the importance of balance among the major powers. No single state had been able to achieve complete dominance, and the outcome reflected a distribution of influence that required ongoing management. This balance would continue to shape decisions in the years that followed, as states sought to maintain their position within it. The experience of the war also influenced how future conflicts would be approached. The complexity of coordinating large-scale alliances, the demands of sustaining long campaigns, and the importance of logistics and planning all became more clearly understood. These lessons would be applied in later situations, affecting both strategy and preparation. For the regions directly affected by the war, the transition to peace brought both relief and challenge. The end of active conflict allowed for recovery, but the effects of years of warfare remained. Rebuilding systems, restoring resources, and reestablishing stability required time and effort, shaped by the conditions created during the war. The political landscape that emerged from the conflict was different from what had existed before. While some structures remained, others have been adjusted or replaced. The relationships between states were now influenced by the outcomes of the war, creating a new context in which future decisions would be made. The legacy of the War of Austrian Succession can be understood as a combination of continuity and change. It confirmed certain principles, such as the importance of recognized succession, while also demonstrating how those principles could be challenged when they conflicted with the interests of powerful states. It showed that agreements alone were not always enough to prevent conflict, but that they could provide a basis for resolution once the balance of power had been established. Over time, the memory of the war became part of the broader understanding of how European politics functioned. It illustrated the interaction between legal claims, strategic interests, and the realities of power. This understanding influenced not only the states directly involved, but the wider system in which they operated. As the story comes to a close, the war can be seen not only as a series of campaigns, but as a process that reshaped the relationships between states and clarified the conditions under which they would interact. The transition from dispute to conflict and from conflict to settlement reflects a pattern that would appear again in different forms. The final outcome was not a simple victory or defeat, but a negotiated balance that allowed the system to continue in a new form. The territories, the alliances, and the principles that had been contested were all brought into a framework that reflected both the cost of the war and the need for stability. In this way, the War of Austrian Succession stands as an example of how complex conflicts develop and how they are ultimately resolved. It shows how power, agreement, and adaptation interact over time, and how the result of that interaction can shape the future long after the conflict itself has ended.